You know, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, they said things were going to be totally different from when they ruled the country a number of years ago. Well, it appears as though the terrorist group is up to their old tricks once again. To discuss this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, joining us once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, the Taliban, who said they were going to be more moderate, are now forcing women to cover up from head to toe once again.
Yeah, nobody's really surprised. This time they're telling women to cover it from head to toe, showing only the eyes. The entire face is going to be veiled. This is, I mean, it goes along with everything that they have pushed so far since coming into office. Of course, look, you're looking at the Middle East, which is already a very conservative place for women in terms of how they dress and how they come out. In the 90s, under the Taliban, you had women wearing burqas, but it was, it kind of was not enforced, kind of enforced. And then when the US came in, it was completely not enforced, of course. And now, not only are they enforcing the burqa, they're enforcing a face veil again, only showing the eyes. And there is a vice and virtue police, kind of like a morality police. We've seen this in countries like the Iranian regime does this as well, where they go around and if you're showing your toes, in sandals in the summertime, or if there's some hair sticking out from your burqa, they'll stop you, they'll whip you, they'll arrest you, all sorts of punishment for the way that women look. Now, this comes as women are also forbidden to fly alone in an airplane, whether it's domestic or international flights, and the airlines have been warned to enforce this. Women are not allowed to drive alone in the car. They need to have a male chaperone. They're not even allowed to run their errands. So if your husband or brother or father can't accompany you, you cannot go to a doctor's appointment. You cannot, I mean, if you remember, there was a story about how women were supposed to hand out the aid that was coming in, the humanitarian aid. And because many of these employees in that department were women, they were not allowed to deliver this aid on their own. So the aid just sat there and it was such a slow process. So you think about all the things that they're doing, and most importantly, not letting young women go to school in 99% of the country. It's tremendous how backwards they're taking Afghanistan. And this is exactly what people had warned. The only time that they assured us that this wouldn't happen is when they wanted to take over the country. And I guess the only people who believe them are the people who are sitting in the White House, who gave the Taliban, ever since they came into office, billions of dollars. And that has been documented. And that's not even counting the technology and the weaponry and the military apparatuses that we left behind when we withdrew from Afghanistan. So the Taliban is sitting pretty. They're sitting in a position of power, and therefore they can exert themselves this way. They can obviously take away human rights with no consequences. None of this aid will be held back. None of the military equipment will be held back. Nothing will be held back. They can just do as they please and rule as they wish.
You know, many women are crying out that they feel like prisoners under Taliban rule, and understandably so, Lisa. It appears as though they simply no longer have basic human rights.
Right, and exactly right. And if they did, the Taliban would keep their own daughters and the women in the country, but they have shipped them off to more moderate, so to speak, Muslim countries like Pakistan next door. Look, if it's a great place, if you're creating this utopia of sorts, well, then keep your women there as well. Don't ship them off. We saw this exactly same thing, same handbook by the Iranian regime that would ship their children off to universities like Harvard and Columbia and Princeton, while other people's children would suffer under their laws that they make. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. There's outcry by human rights groups, but I mean, falling on deaf ears all throughout the world.
We've seen protests from a lot of the women in Afghanistan in the past, especially with the teachers speaking out. Will we see more of that?
There would be if the people in Afghanistan felt like they had some wiggle room, that they had some breathing space, that there would not be such crackdowns that would cost them their lives. And I think in this case, as I said, that the Taliban has the upper hand in every way. So they're getting people off the streets. They're getting women not to come to school. They're getting women not to be alone in the car. There's curfews that are in place. And, if people gather to protest, I'm sure there will be very, very brutal consequences to those protests. And therefore, I don't think the people of Afghanistan are in that place right now. Now, fast forward to a place like, again, I'm going to make a comparison to the Iranian regime. After 40 years, they thought we have nothing to lose at this point. We are suffocating under this government, and the only way to perhaps get the world's attention is to come out onto the streets. But that's when they believe that they could perhaps get some support, first by the Obama administration, and then when that failed, by the Trump administration. Now, in this case, it's not going to be under this administration where they get any sort of support. So if there should be a different world order, perhaps a different president here in the United States, or more leniency and more attention by the rest of the world, then perhaps they would risk it all to come out. But we've forgotten about Afghanistan, Hal. You don't hear about it. You don't see the headlines anymore. So they'll have to wait to see better circumstances.
Yeah, it's all about the war in Ukraine right now with Russia, and we'll talk about that in more detail in just a moment here. But Lisa, let's talk a bit about Israel, and they're considering military operations in Gaza and other regions in response to some of the recent terror waves. Tell me more about that.
Right. And this is always the pros and cons that Israel has to weigh out in the aftermath of a terror wave. Look, it's not any day that goes by. Perhaps we don't hear about some of them because these are either foiled plots, or, we just, the mainstream media just doesn't cover it. Or you have, one or two deaths. And of course, that means everything to those children who are losing their parents with a stabbing attack or a suicide bombing. But it doesn't mean enough to the rest of the world to cover these stories. And because of that, we're not hearing about it when Israel does decide to retaliate. If they do so, in each instance that we've seen this retaliation, A, they have been extremely targeted. B, they have made announcements and gone door to door to get civilians out of harm's way, because they literally want to just target weapons depots and the homes of these terrorists. And thirdly, in the world of in the court of global opinion, Israel always loses. So the mainstream media comes to the rescue only when Israel decides to retaliate, and then you have all the opinions about how Israel is so brutal and it's an apartheid state, and that they are, cracking down on Palestinian or innocent Palestinians. But the truth is, the only people who are cracking down on innocent Palestinians are the leadership, Hamas, the leadership that puts them in harm's way, that uses every dime they get for terrorism instead of helping the Palestinian people and putting them in the predicament that we're in. Just last week, the head of Hamas said, "Do what you can. Use any weapon you have. It could be a car, it could be an axe, it could be a hammer." And sure enough, there was an axe attack on Independence Day in Israel where people were out and about celebrating. 3 young men, who collectively had 16 young children among them, lost their lives in an axe attack. So they're listening, they are doing their do-it-yourself type of terrorism and attacking innocent civilians on the streets of Israel.
Speaking of attacking innocent civilians, Lisa, the war in Ukraine continues, and 60 more are feared dead in the bombing of a Ukrainian school. Why is it that so many attacks are launched against schools, apartment complexes? Is it that the Vladimir Putin regime wants to crush the spirit of the Ukrainian people?
Well, absolutely. That's part of it. We're hearing a lot about schools and all sorts of infrastructures that are being taken down, apartment buildings, like you said, where many families live. If I would give you two responses to that. A, it is a crushing, and it's taking apart parts of society, right? Schools and communities and places where people live and have their homes and neighborhoods. But secondly, because the Russians probably believe that Ukrainians are hiding specific and sensitive materials in these places. So they would think the global handbook, it says you shouldn't attack a school, or you shouldn't attack communities because civilians live there. So that's where they would perhaps hide weapons and things that are much more sensitive, including military personnel and others. So that would be probably my guess as to why Russia would target these places where it seems like they shouldn't, and it seems much more harsh than it is.
Wow. Now here's another scary comment. The Russian Space Agency chief boasted about nuclear capabilities and claims that NATO would lose in 30 minutes?
My goodness, right? As we inch closer and closer to this threat that NATO may have to get involved because of Article 5, getting involved because of a neighboring state. Well, that's when we have these threats flying around, and Russia says, well, if NATO were to get involved, we'd beat you all in 30 minutes. Well, then why haven't you been able to finish up the job in Ukraine in 30 minutes? And that there's a lot of threats flying around here. And we know that Putin is not one to back down and look weak. So then that's where the threats come out, and that's where it gets ugly. The good news is that the global, community is trying to not let this escalate. But the other question becomes, where do we give Putin his off ramp? If this does not escalate, which it looks like it will, how do we get Putin to back down, perhaps feel like a winner? What is the off ramp? There's more questions than answers, unfortunately, Hal, but we do know that we're looking at this figuration where you want Putin to back down. You want this to not escalate, but at the same time, there's not too many options left for Putin rather than to escalate and put an end to this once and for all.
Lisa, a U.S. Senator, Lindsey Graham, pushed to label Russia a state sponsor of terrorism and called for the expansion of NATO to deter the Kremlin from any future invasions.
Right. So these are the ways in which different politicians, whether in Europe or the United States, are trying to put an end to this. Just say, let's call, the Russia, if we do call Russia a terrorist organization, if we are able to get NATO involved in some capacity, then we can perhaps defang Russia. We can take away some of their power, whether they think that they can stand up to NATO, whether they think they can use nuclear weapons. Perhaps we need to say, the world is standing against you. You need to back down, and let's have this conversation. The unfortunate part is that Putin does not respond well to such threats. And if they were to give Putin more labels, because if you remember when we were giving him the label of or accusing him of war crimes, that's where Putin said, "I'm going to make you regret that." So I don't think he's going to respond well to any labels or names or designations, but at the same time, as I said, there has to be some sort of way to de-escalate this without getting NATO involved or any other nations involved in what is already a brutal war that has been senseless and has already paid too much for what it is.
Now, here's something kind of bizarre. There were reports that Bono and U2 put on a concert for a few hundred people in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. I mean, this is a war-torn nation where there's a war going on right now. Apparently, they said because the Russian troops moved eastward, it was safe to put on a concert to help boost the spirits of the Ukrainian people. Don't you find that a little odd?
Oh, extremely odd when you have lawmakers that are fearful for their lives to travel to Ukraine and Kyiv, for that matter, to have talks with the Ukrainian president. And he urged Biden to come. And of course, Secretary of State Blinken made the trip, and then Nancy Pelosi made the trip. So we have seen, obviously lawmakers stand back from this because of the threat, and then to have, and then to try to evacuate as many people as possible, but then to put on a concert of this scale does sound odd. But if they're saying they're doing it for the spirit and the, to boost the morality of the Ukrainian people, it does seem like a nice gesture. It just seems very unsafe and not so sound in decision making.
Lisa, an Islamic State affiliate in Egypt claimed responsibility for an attack on a water pumping station on Sunday east of the Suez Canal, killing at least 11 soldiers.
Yeah, it was a very, very unfortunate attack, especially we know that the military in Egypt is trying very hard to bring that nation into a modern place where they are free of these terrorist elements. And talk about ISIS wanting to get street credibility and to become relevant once again. They are trying their best to have some sort of reputation again, to come back on the scene. If you remember, Donald Trump claimed to put an end to ISIS, and they want to say, nope, it's like playing whack-a-mole, right? We're still here. And what they did in the Middle East is in places where, like Israel, for example, where we saw these one-off attacks, and ISIS would come and say, we're the ones who influenced that attack, or we're the ones radicalizing people, we're the ones who are going to claim responsibility for these attacks, and now in Egypt as well. So they're staying out of areas like Syria and Iraq, where we do see these one-off attacks by ISIS, but they're trying to gain street credibility by expanding their sphere of influence by going into places like Israel and Egypt, or so they claim. But the bottom line here is that, look, they are back on the scene. They want to be back on the scene, and they will do whatever it takes to get this type of reputation and to say, look, we didn't go anywhere. We're still here, and we will launch these attacks.
Chinese armed forces carried out another round of military exercises near Taiwan last week. Lisa, Taiwan has been complaining for the past couple of years about frequent Chinese military activity near it. In fact, Taiwan's Air Force even scrambled planes on Friday to warn away 18 Chinese aircraft that entered its defense zone. Let me ask you, could we see a war developing there as well?
Yeah, perhaps. Look, it's something that everyone's been waiting for. And even before we saw the Ukraine flare up, people warned about China getting into Taiwan, and they were absolutely flirting with it and tiptoeing into territory and trying to get global attention. And because of what's going on in Ukraine, Taiwan is taking a lesson from the Ukrainians and trying to beef up their assets to not let that happen. We know that, the White House and European allies are definitely aware of what's going on there, and are keeping an eye on it. But the thing with China is that you never know. You never know when they'll surprise us and what they have planned. And obviously, there's no transparency there. But they keep showing us, and they keep flexing their muscles, just like North Korea. But China, in relation to Taiwan and what they want there, they absolutely will make it known to the world, and they have through these types of exercises that just go into the territory and come back, just go in and come back. Well, one of these days it will just be going in and not coming back. And that's what we will have to prepare for, and decide how the world will respond. The one thing that this White House has not been clear on, well, many things, but in terms of their foreign policy, one of the most important issues that they have not been clear on is what they will do or how they will respond to a threat from China, a hot threat from China. Obviously, there's an ongoing threat from China, but if there's a new, more escalated threat from China, how they would respond. And perhaps that's not something they're sharing, but I hope that that is something that they are preparing for, because it seems like we're moving in that direction.
Foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari, thanks a lot for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure.